Nationalism is something that seems to really divide East and Western Europe. In the West, patriotic feeling and national sentiment seem to have become something taboo, especially after World War II. And in Eastern Europe, especially in Poland, it seems to be something that's celebrated. Most starkly, this can be seen in the Polish Independence Day March, which has become a Holy Land meeting point for writers all over the European world who want to marvel at it. So, I thought I'd go there and see what all the fuss is about. Normally, when I visit a country, I like to spend as much time as possible to get a true feeling of the place. This time I only had 5 days, but I was able to visit 2 dark tourist hotspots, the Polish Independence Day March and Auschwitz death camp. Weird trip, I'll admit, but I think these 2 places do sort of sum up the Polish experience, which has certainly had its ups and downs. References to the Polans as a Slavic tribe go back to the 700s, and the first Polish state, the Duchy of Poland, was founded in 966. If we went over everything, we'd be here for well over an hour, but the short version is that they are one of the many indigenous, ancient ethnic groups of Europe. So here's the Cliff Notes version. After founding the Kingdom of Poland, this ended up becoming the massive Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth with an elected king. Slowly, they got dismantled by Russia, Prussia, and the Austrian empires. Napoleon briefly turns up and creates a Polish puppet state before it is lost. For that, he still gets praise in the Polish national anthem. During World War I, there were Poles on both sides, as Russia and Germany both collapsed, and Polish nationalists were able to establish an independent Polish state. So on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, in the Anglosphere, we remember all those who died in great sorrow. However, in Poland, it is something in which there is a celebration of the sacrifice that was faced to give Poland its independence back. But now that Poland had found her independence, it would all be smooth sailing from here. No. What followed was probably the darkest period in all of Polish history. First, the Germans invaded, and then the Soviets joined them. The country was split in 2 between the National Socialists and the Communists. The Soviets deported Poles in cattle cars to become slave labour in the frozen East, and rounded up 10,000 educated Poles, most likely to form resistance, and executed them in the Katyn massacre. Whilst the Germans, well, we all know what the Germans did. The Polish set up an underground state to continue the fight, and eventually rose up in armed rebellion in the Warsaw Uprising. The Soviets were now fighting the Germans and moving towards Warsaw. They decided to wait on the eastern side of the city and watch as the Polish resistance were crushed. F in the chat, boys. The Soviets wanted a Polish puppet state, not an independent Poland. So after the war, that's what they enforced. Now I found a common view in Poland being that we, as the British, betrayed the Polish in this moment, because we started the Second World War on the basis of defending Poland from the Germans, and by the end of it, they'd been turned into a puppet state of the Soviets. Now, I concede sympathy in this viewpoint, but frankly, beating the Germans cost us literally everything, so there was nothing we could do. But for the Poles, this meant the fight was not over, and Poland was not yet lost. They resisted the Soviet occupation as much as they could, and after a Pole became the Pope and visited Poland, the Solidarity movement was established and ultimately led to the liberation of the country from communism. This is the moment for Poland in which they consider occupation to have ended. From 1939 to 1989, 50 years of National Socialist and Soviet occupation. So naturally, Polish politics is very anti-Nazi and very anti-communist. But back to Polish Independence Day. The government does put on a show and a celebration of Independence Day. And it's very interesting, I did go to see it.
Szanowni Państwo, przemówienie z okazji Narodowego Święta Niepodległości wygłosi prezydent Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej, zwierzchnik Sił Zbrojnych, pan Andrzej Duda.
Walany na kolana wstawał za każdym razem, który nie załamywał się tym, że ginęli kolejni, który szedł naprzód, wierząc w to, że swoje państwo odzyska. To było dzięki temu, że wszyscy ci, którzy prowadzili wtedy politykę polską i ku Polsce, niezłomnie w tę Polskę wierzyli, że ona wróci. Mówił Wincenty Witos: nie ma sprawy ważniejszej niż Polska. Mówił drugi z ojców naszej niepodległości, Ignacy Jan Paderewski: silna, wielka, wolna, niepodległa Polska była istotą mojego istnienia. Jej urzeczywistnienie jest celem mojego życia. Oni wierzyli w kraju i za granicą. Tutaj walczyli, choć nie mieli wtedy swojego państwa, wierzyli w to, że je odzyskają.
But it's not what attracted international attention. The international attention of Polish Independence Day is on the march. And the march's history is very interesting. From what I can understand, it started out as basically some angry lads who were upset about the way Polish society was going and wanted to make their voices heard, so organised a march in central Warsaw. Now, some socialists decided that they wanted to oppose this march, declaring the marchers as far-right, and so turned up calling themselves Antifa, and scuffles quickly broke out. But this is what exploded the event. Because there were socialists trying to suppress a Polish Independence Day march, given the history of Poland, this didn't look very good. And what happened is that the popularity of the march skyrocketed, and ever since has attracted thousands, if not tens of thousands of people every single year. Also, one of the nice things about this march organised by the Nationalists is that you don't need to speak Polish. You can get the message pretty quickly as to what this is about. You could be an illiterate serf and still understand what this is about, which is basically what I am, because I don't speak Polish. Or read it. So hey-ho, time to be a serf. I was actually lucky enough to meet Krzysztof Bozak, who was one of those angry lads in the beginning, and I got to interview him at Visegrad 24 studio, who happened to be friends and very kindly let me use their studio for it. And
hello.
Thank you for joining me.
Nice to see you again in Poland.
So I think I'm going to cut in segments from Krzysztof where they make sense. It's a bit weird that my holidays now consist of interviewing politicians, but it's It's good fun.
It started during progressive government of civic platform. So it was also a biggest opposition manifestation against political correctness and against center-left government.
Nam, Polakom, i miejmy głęboką nadzieję, że nadal my, jako Polacy, będziemy we własnym kraju gospodarzem. Polak w Polsce gospodarzem!
First Polish March of Independence was in 2010, and they tried to physically block it, and they openly said that they try to copy the strategy of German anti-fascists. So they branded organizers, my colleagues and me, in fact, as Nazis, which was 100% false. They tried to block March of Independence for many years, but they didn't succeed. And since maybe 7 or 8 years, they don't try to block. They organize in a different part of the city their own march, small, without Polish flags, with left-wing symbols.
With the march becoming so large and infamous, it started to attract political attention, not only from the major parties in Poland, but also internationally, and has now become a meeting point for nationalists all over Europe who wish to witness it. But the vast majority of the attendees are just Polish patriots of all kinds. The main thing that everyone does is buy themselves Polish flags. Polish girls buy themselves Polish flag-coloured hairbands. But what everyone does is get themselves Polish armbands, the same style that were used during the Warsaw Uprising. And I did manage to bring a few back, so those will be the only items I have for sale this time around. For people who don't know, I like to bring back things and sell them from the various trips to help fund them, and it gives you something in return for subscribing, to help keep the financing coming to do these things. So if you'd like to do that, you can go over to Subscribestar, ask me if they're still in stock, and if yes, I will be able to sell you one. Otherwise, you can always just subscribe to keep the videos coming, or purchase some of the old stuff from the old trips. And again, thank you to everyone who has. You make this possible. And for the time being, everyone who subscribes gets access not only to the private members club on Discord, but also 10 Soviet rubles for free, because I still have plenty to go. Anyway, back on track.
Raczej gardzić w potrzebach naszych, ale od wszelakich złych przygód. Racz nas zawsze wybawiać. Panno chwalebna i błogosławiona, o Pani nasza, orędowniczko nasza, pośredniczko nasza, pocieszycielko nasza.
Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, ziemi włoskiej do Polski, nad Twoim przewodem złączył się z narodem. Tym Wisłem przejdzie warte, będzie Polakami. Dał nam przykład Bonaparte, jak zwyciężać mamy. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem łączy się z narodem. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski, z ziemi włoskiej do Polski, za Twoim przewodem łączy się z narodem. Czarnecki do Poznania po szwedzkim zaborze, dla ojczyzny ratowania rzuci się przez morze. Marsz, marsz Dąbrowski. Polska państwem narodowym! Narodowe Siły Zbrojne RSZ! Nie tęczowa, nie laicka, tylko Polska katolicka!
Why do you have Bandera?
You got Bandera here, right here, just because we hate him.
He killed Poles and Jews,
Yes,
right?
of course. Obviously.
Is the problem now because of Ukrainians?
Yes.
They come to Poland and
yes,
still like him?
Yes.
Okay.
He is their hero, you know. We have monuments in cities. His name is on the streets in Ukraine, and that's a real big problem for us.
But the main focus for most international media was on a small group that turn up every single year, this one included, of fascists and white nationalists. Usually because this is something to shock their audiences with. These guys like to turn up in black with their faces covered and keep organised to themselves, in a block. They force people with cameras out and chant their slogans with the image they are giving off in mind.
Pięści w górę prawe! Pięści w górę prawe wszyscy! Wszyscy! Zaciśnij pięć! Nie zaciskaj pasa! Zaciśnij pięć! Teraz! Młodzi, aktywni, radykalni! Młodzi, aktywni, radykalni! Młodzi, aktywni!
I did manage to speak to a couple of these people, which included a couple of Americans. In fact, one of them was from the American group Patriot Front. So I went up to him and said, "Hello, my fellow Fed." And he responded, "Ah yes, another Fed." The rest of them, however, didn't seem to have much of a sense of humour, and acted with hostility to any kind of questions. And most interestingly, this aspect of the march seems to be the most international, with European fascists from all types turning up. If you think I'm being a bit of a silly journo by using that word, I don't believe I am. One of the groups even called themselves the Syndicalist Socialist Alternative. These seemed like the kind of people who would read an awful lot of political theory, and although most of them were as hostile to me as socialists are in the UK, it was kind of interesting to see genuine fascists in the flesh. In the Anglosphere, this is of course incredibly rare.
It was always like that on the March of Independence, that many different groups with different views and people who support different football clubs or different political parties, let's say from radical nationalists to people who support law and justice, they march together because of the respect for Polish independence and Polish state and Polish tradition, history, heritage, and because of patriotism. I think it's good that we are so different and we are on the one march and we accept that situation. They have their own views. They would like to express their views. They do not break the law. So they have the right to be there. They are Polish patriots. I do not agree with them on many levels. They probably don't like me because they think that I'm too centrist. They even had some slogans against us as a confederation this year.
But that level of political diversity, I mean, I saw people, for example, all the way from being completely normal centrist Polish flag wavers to people who were there with anti-Azov banners, Catholic nationalists, and then in the black bloc, I'd find people even with like the Black Sun. There was one guy with that. So is the reason this is the case, this massive political diversity, is it because it's a march open to everyone, and therefore, if you support Poland, even if you're a socialist or a communist, they would be allowed to be there?
Good question. I don't think so. I think that everybody feels that there is a spectrum for Polish patriots, and we can argue on many issues. For example, last 2 or 3 years, we had groups who are pro-Ukrainian and who are anti-Ukrainian on some level. But you should accept basic values: Polish independence, national sovereignty, respect for the tradition, respect for Christian values, and of course communists, socialists do not accept this. And what is most important, they do not accept the organizers, which are Polish nationalists who organize this march, and they hate people who organize this march, so they will never come.
But as I mentioned, these guys are a really small part of the march. The main march is made up of just mass amounts of Polish patriots from all kinds of groups. The vast majority are random Polish patriots who wave Polish flags, but there are also Polish reenactors, biker gangs, anti-socialists, anti-abortion, anti-EU types, anti-Stefan Bandera activists, and then there are the Polish fascists and white nationalists. The kind of people who think about the Roman Empire a lot. The whole thing ends near a football stadium with a stage show, street food, and is right next to the train station in case you want to get out of the cold. It's a strangely nice thing to have witnessed. I don't think I could ever say that I took part in this, or can even take part. It felt instead like I was observing the Polish right and how they interact with their independence. Everyone was incredibly tolerant of each other, which might seem a strange thing to note, but the group isn't actually as unified as it might seem. Obviously, the main thing that actually unites them is the love of Polish independence. But, for example, I mean, you could see both political parties being there. I saw people from Law and Justice, and then those from Confederation. These two political parties don't like each other. and all of various groups. Obviously, there's even more disagreements that could go on forever. But regardless, it was quite nice to see how a patriotic movement looks, especially considering how rare it is in the UK. But after all that, I did my first ever meetup. Lovely to meet you all. And then it was time to go and see the site most known for dark tourism in Poland, Auschwitz concentration and death camp. Except this place is not called Auschwitz. That's a German name, given by Germans when they tried to colonize the area during the Second World War. The Polish name, I can't pronounce because it's Polish, so I'll just let the train announcer do that.
Destination Auschwitz.
When the Germans came here, they depopulated the town and set up a 10-kilometer zone in which only they would operate with the SS, and set up the first concentration camp, Auschwitz I. When the order came for the extermination of the Jews and undesirables, this is when Auschwitz Birkenau was built, which is an extermination camp, otherwise known as Auschwitz II. These days, this place does seem to be just your average Polish town, but the locals are well aware that their only source of tourism is the concentration and death camp. Immediately after the war, a small percentage of those responsible were put on trial at Nuremberg, and we still have the camp commandant's transcript from the Nuremberg trials. According to the camp commandant, in 6 weeks, bursts of 3 trains with 2,000 prisoners on each would turn up daily, depending on the circumstances. Those fit to work would fill the empty space in the 2 camps, and those unfit or unnecessary were exterminated. Towards the end of the war, the bombing runs knocked out the rail system, and logistically it became impossible to continue. After Nuremberg, he was sentenced to death, and the camp was turned into a museum in 1947. Immediately, the museum became a political tool. For example, the countries whose citizens were exterminated here were allowed to set up their own exhibits, telling their own unique story. And naturally, communist countries like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia decided their exhibits would just focus on victims of fascism. There are claims online as to some of these exhibits, such as there is a claim in the early days that the Soviet Union put on an exhibit to try and compare the conditions of the camp to the conditions of people living in the West. I wasn't able to find a source for that one, but for definite, the whole situation became incredibly politically complicated, especially after the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia collapsed, as to who would be allowed to set up exhibits and what would be allowed to be shown. For example, with the Yugoslav nations, it was agreed upon that the former Yugoslav nations would have to agree on what the Yugoslav exhibit would be. Naturally, they couldn't agree on anything, and nothing has been shown since. Visiting, you will be met with the concrete building that is the visitor centre, before you walk down to the surrounding buildings used by the camp and its guards, and finally the entrance with the "Work sets you free" in metal letters above you. As you travel from building to building, you can learn about the specific horrors that took place, such as the execution area, known as the Death Wall. About 15,000 Polish citizens were shot here, and about 1,000 Soviet citizens. Many of those were Polish resistance fighters, with the most famous last words being, "Long live Poland." There is Block 10 for medical experiments, a lot of dead kids, and then Block 11, the punishment block, a place of not only immense suffering, but the birthplace of the use of Zyklon B, as it is listed as the location in which it was first tested to exterminate prisoners. But it is also a place of immense heroism. When a prisoner escaped, 10 would be selected for death. And so, as a Polish sergeant was selected for death, he began crying about his wife and children, and a bishop stepped forward to take his place. In the cell where he was murdered, a monument to his heroism still stands. It was at this point that I began to notice that these Polish stories are something I'd never heard before. And in fact, one of the buildings was converted into an exhibit entirely dedicated to Polish resistance during the war and even in the camps. Polish resistance was truly legendary and ran by some serious mad lads. One of them even decided to volunteer for a mission in which he broke into Auschwitz with the dedicated goal of setting up a resistance movement within the camp. Sadly, he failed and had to leave, but this guy then went on to fight in the Warsaw Uprising and even continued his resistance against the Soviets until his death. Absolute mad lad. Camp 1, however, is nothing compared to Auschwitz Birkenau, Camp number 2. Camp 2 was a purpose-built death camp, and it is the reason Auschwitz is the one death camp everyone can mention. The National Socialists set up hundreds of different kinds of camps for different purposes, but only 6 were extermination camps. Auschwitz Camp 2 is the one that killed the most people, making up 35% of all extermination camp deaths at an estimated 1.1 million, around 90% being Jews. For perspective, this is about 400,000 people less than those who died in the Battle of Leningrad. World War II was not fun. To get there, you have to take the Auschwitz bus, and once you arrive and walk through the famous entrance, the sheer scale of the thing hits you. The very centre is an area for train drop-off. There is a single wagon left in place in memory. Walking through the camp, I eventually came to a gas chamber. Initially, the exterminations were done in the Little Red House, which was a converted old house nearby, but then 4 professional purpose-built gas chambers were built inside of the camp grounds, much closer to the drop-off point. Now they are largely rubble. In fact, most of the camp is rubble, and what is left is even smaller than what happened at peak size of the camp, and you can see this in aerial photographs of some of the downsizing. But it was approaching closing time, and the last thing I wanted to do was check out some of the buildings where prisoners were kept for work detail. And given it was winter, it was already getting incredibly dark. And I have to say, an extermination camp in the dark is probably one of the spookiest things in existence. But with that, it was time to go. And thanks to time constraints, I wasn't actually able to see everything I wanted to. So I certainly recommend leaving a full day to actually experience both camps in their fullest. But if you are going to go, word of advice, remember it is an extermination camp. Don't take smiley selfies outside of it. Apparently this is a routine problem, especially with women. They really, really don't like that. This trip, however, did leave me with some opinions, which, bugger it, this video is not getting monetized anyway, is it? Polish Independence Day was truly something to behold, and something that you have to feel quite proud for the Poles for having, especially with everything they've been through. It's sort of their way of saying that we're still here despite everyone and everything, which I just have to respect, and frankly I just hope they can keep it. As for Auschwitz, I can finally understand what people mean when they say you have to see it in person for it to truly hit you. And this isn't like most things where it's just the difference of seeing it on TV versus in reality. I really think that most media and films have a difficulty in conveying the reality of this place to the audience. And I would put this down to the fact that most of this is done through 2 perspectives, either the Jewish perspective or what I'm going to call the German perspective. The German perspective is one that is incredibly dry, in which the pure facts and figures are told, the story relayed, and leaves you with a feeling of not really understanding how this happened, and also a feeling that it is not to be discussed again, which doesn't convey reality. What I would call the Jewish perspective is something that leaves you distraught as to how something inhuman could actually happen, and leaves you with an almost physical sickness that means that you're not really able to comprehend how this could have happened. And I think this feeling can be most easily described through Holocaust memorials, such as the one in Berlin, which is made up of these unnerving concrete blocks with walkways between them that leave you utterly disorientated and distraught by the feeling of even being there. And you can get a similar feeling when you visit the Auschwitz Museum. The entrance is made up of a long, featureless concrete hallway, with the only thing that you can hear is the names of the various victims being played over loudspeakers.
Moszek Bar, Antoni Holon, Pavel Friedman.
Whereas when you're in the camps, they're not featureless, nor are they incomprehensible. Instead, they're a very real place in which you can get a sense of what happened here and how and why it happened. And in which case, that feeling is something unique. In fact, I've only ever felt it once before, when I watched a movie called Conspiracy about the Wannsee Conference. And the Wannsee Conference is where a group of Nazis met to decide on how they would exterminate the Jews. There is a German version of the film, which is incredibly dry and poorly reviewed because it feels like you're watching some kind of courtroom reenacting of what happened. Whereas the British version actually allows the people playing those roles to have characters, and you can see the interpersonal stuff between the human beings who did this and the different views they come to. And in which case, you don't see them as some kind of inhuman monsters that can't really exist in life, but instead some incredibly hate-filled men who had the power and ability to carry out the exterminations that they wanted to. And that's far more real. That's far more striking. And I think that's really the correct way to deal with this subject, and why being there is such a hit, even when I've heard about these stories many times before I'd come. And I just had a feeling that that's how this topic should actually be dealt with. But anyway, that's an opinion based on a feeling. If you disagree, that's fine. We'll all be friends trying to find the most interesting places on Earth. If you'd like to support me, of course you can go over to Subscribestar and subscribe to keep the financial support incoming, or buy yourself an armband, etc. Otherwise, subscribing on YouTube, liking, sharing, all helps. And I do still read every single comment. Thank you and goodbye.